Is Patricia Kong, and I'd like to welcome you to November's Scrum Pulse. Today we're going to be talking to a few professional Scrum trainers, which I'll introduce in a minute. We can't see one of them, Mark Noneman. He's here, but he's on a boat with low bandwidth, but he's still attending, and just wanted to let you know that that person is there. But anyways, just to kick this off, in June, Kurt Bittner and I gave an introduction to evidence-based management. So we did a Scrum Pulse there. And what we talked about was how do you use evidence-based management as a framework to improve your ability to measure and improve your ability to deliver value. And from that webinar, we actually got a lot of great questions and a lot of follow-up, whereas we thought, hey, maybe let's give the public, let's give the community an opportunity to talk to some of our professional Scrum trainers who are Scrum coaches, technical coaches, management coaches, who are actually implementing this using EBM at their own companies or in the field, and take your questions. So with that, next slide, please, Lindsay. So again, this is an Ask a PST webinar series. Feel free to put your questions into the chat or the question panel, which I'll show you in a little bit. But this is really a great way for you to learn or hear about the experiences from our professional Scrum trainers. And if you don't get your question answered, these guys are going to answer them all for you post-webinar, allegedly. So that's that. And actually, who is a PST? So next slide, please, Lindsay. So who is Scrum.org? Scrum.org is not this slide. Scrum.org is you guys and the people, professional Scrum trainers that you see and can talk to today. We do try to work toward the mission of improving the profession of software delivery. We do that through the community, training, education, and certification, of course. So there's a lot of pretty colors on this slide. Those are representative of courses that we have. You might notice there's an extra badge on the left, which is for our Professional Scrum Product Owner Advanced class. A lot of great product management stuff, and of course the corresponding assessments and certifications that go with that. We're founded by Ken Schwaber. Had coffee with him this morning. He may be also asking some questions, guys, just to let you know. Don't be scared. All right, next slide. So very quickly, hopefully this isn't the first time you're seeing this picture, but evidence-based management is a framework that we kicked off, to be honestly, 6 or 7 years ago. There are several introductory webinars that you can hear about the genesis of this, how we're thinking about it from continuous improvement. We'll talk about that more today. But what I want to stress is that evidence-based management for us is a way of saying, hey, how do we think about value and how do we measure that? So we broke it down into 4 key value areas that really think about, okay, outward facing, what do we look at from the market? What is our organizational capability to try to achieve those things? And you see the 4 key value areas here: current value, unrealized value, your ability to innovate, and time to market. And what we do is when we look at those areas, when we really think about outcomes in those areas, how do we start to look at these things holistically, the information that we have, so that we can make decisions, right? So how do we use that to manage? How do we think about these holistically? How does one thing affect the other? And our professional Scrum trainers will be able to talk about that today and potentially how they visualize that. So next slide, please, Lindsay. The evidence-based management guide is an introduction into this, and so we released that in January 2019. I'm going to be working on a new release probably for next year, but everything that's on this slide stands in terms of how do we use evidence to make the best decisions that we can at that point. How do we inspect and adapt, right? So how do we measure, take that data, how do we adapt to try to continuously improve toward a goal, and to understand that the goal is not about being agile. What is the goal? That depends on you. You know that better than me. But I can tell you it's not about being agile. It's about something else. So in that end, I'd like to introduce you to our panelists today. Next slide, please. And these are really wonderful people, beautiful people inside and out. I've worked with them extensively. I think, Todd, I knew you before you were even a professional Scrum trainer. But I'm going to let you guys introduce yourself. So let's start with Ty.
Good morning. My name is Ty Crockett. I'm in Dallas, Texas, and my background is a strange one. I come from hardware and software infrastructure and got into being a Scrum Master pretty early. I found my love for product management shortly thereafter, and then I found my way towards answering the question of how do we know we're winning, and that's kind of how I got involved with evidence-based management. I'm a nerd. I like games of all sorts. I used to draw comic books. I have allergies. You know how it works.
Is that what a nerd is?
And some other stuff. Star Wars.
Todd?
Yeah, good morning. I'm Todd Miller. I've been a trainer for coming up on 4 years. As Patricia mentioned, I actually met Patricia at a beta teach of the Scale Professional Scrum course, I believe. My background is that of a software developer. I went from a software developer, have experience as a Scrum Master, been a product owner quite a few times. And what's always really turned me on about the metrics conversation is what do we measure? Why do we measure it? And what effect does that have on a system? And I get those questions a lot. I learned those really early on from my developer days and understanding what people were measuring about me. I'm also a self-proclaimed nerd, just like Ty, although he totally wins that. I never drew comic books, but I like video games a lot, and I am an avid fitness guy. I presently work for a company called Youre Group, and that's about it for me.
All right, Mark?
Hi, my name is Mark Noneman. I work for a company called Agility Software. That's my company. My background actually is electrical engineering, and I did that for quite a number of years. And in working with electronic systems, I got very involved with system engineering, and we used a lot of systems thinking in order to understand cause and effect and impacts, things of that nature. I've been a professional Scrum trainer for, I think 7 years, maybe 8, I'm not sure. And also involved with a lot of different kinds of lean and agile training and coaching and helping people understand. I got involved with evidence-based management initially because my clients were asking about metrics in an agile environment, particularly a Scrum environment originally. And Scrum.org has, as Patricia mentioned, been talking about evidence-based management for quite some time. So leveraging those ideas and those concepts with people, and pretty important to me that not only that we have measures, but it's what we do with them that matters. And so it's probably worth mentioning that I'm also one of the co-stewards of the evidence-based management courseware that we're developing with Scrum.org. So I'm deeply involved.
Deeply involved. Thank you. Mark is also, I don't know if he's a nerd, but he is avid wine drinker and into boats. So we'll throw that in there for you today, Mark.
I just like the wine.
That is something, thank you, Mark, for reminding me. So not only do Ty, Todd, and Mark have a lot of experience in the field and working, with teams and throughout the organization, executives, management, et cetera, and talking and implementing EBM, but these 3 gentlemen are part of the development team. So Mark is a steward that works with our community to build the workshop, but Ty and Todd and Mark and I have sat in Boston and Burlington, Massachusetts, where we're based at Scrum.org, to develop a workshop that is hopefully going to help people understand evidence-based management better and how that can help their organizations. So let's talk about quick guidelines for the Ask a PST. Lindsay, so we have some questions that have been coming through already, but your microphones, just because it's more simple, are going to be muted throughout, but we do want you to ask questions. Please use the chat, please use the questions, and as usual, put them in there. I'll be taking a look and trying to monitor and ask questions to the PSTs as they come in. So start getting those in, and if we don't get to them, we'll find a way to answer them, like I said, after the webinar. So let's start with this. And I've talked about this previously, but I think a great thing to talk about is you guys are all involved in the general, genesis almost of EBM. So what do you think for you evidence-based management really is? Why does it exist? Why has this been something that you guys have wanted to use with your clients? Mark, since you're the steward, I think you're the best person that I'd like to start with. So, why does EBM exist? What does it mean to you? And, why do you even use that with your clients?
That's pretty important. And for me, evidence-based management really fundamentally is a management framework. We're going to talk about evidence and metrics, and that's kind of where it all started because people didn't know what to measure as they started to change the way they develop new products using things like Scrum or other Agile practices. And so that's where the questions usually start. Also, people that have adopted practices like Scrum or other Agile techniques usually starts pretty low in the organization at the team level. Usually it starts there. And then my experience has been that executives tend to get kind of excited about it because the people doing the work get excited about it. But the problem in that environment is that middle management doesn't know what it is that they should be doing. We don't have our requirements documents and our Gantt charts and our, the status reporting that we're used to. And now management is wondering how we're supposed to manage because they still have that responsibility and they still desire to do good work and add value. So how can we help them? So really evidence-based management for me is that framework that fills in what should management be doing in order to help drive the organization forward. And although you can use evidence-based management to sort of, let's say, run the operations of a company, its real power comes out in terms of helping the organization drive toward strategic direction, toward important goals in the organization. And that's where evidence-based management really starts to give people a lot of benefit.
Now, for you, does this change the notion of management at all, or does it the traditional way that some people may think of management, does this, do you think, help them to articulate management in a different way, or is it entirely about decision making?
No, I think, well, it's certainly about decision making, and I suppose one might argue that that's what management is. However, I would say yes, it does change management approaches from what, at least from my experience of traditional management approaches. And here's how I would liken it. Scrum at the development team level is a framework to help people employ empiricism, to use empirical evidence to make decisions day to day and how best to value in their new product development. And it's been awesome at helping people think about that and understand it and change their behavior in order to get value, better value, and also value early and often to their customers and clients and users. So evidence-based management is similar at the management level. It is a framework to allow management to behave in an empirical way, to gather evidence, to inspect what's really going on. Of course, it requires transparency, just like Scrum does. And then using the evidence, make decisions about how to make change in the organization. How do we drive forward? And it could be small changes to solve problems in the here and now. And as I said, the real power comes in inspecting and adapting our progress toward really important new objectives, that is to say, strategic direction for the company. So I think it says, look, management should use actual evidence. They should use empiricism, and evidence-based management is a framework to help them do that.
Awesome, thank you for that. And so one of the things, obviously, Mark was bringing up the whole notion and the importance of empiricism and inspection and adaptation. Now, Ty, you were helping Scrum.org when this was, I'm just going to say it, when this was a part of something called CIF, Continuous Improvement Framework. So can you talk a little bit about how you think about EBM and continuous improvement? Because it's almost one of the things that got, as we started developing on this more and more and further, what people were really interested in was really this notion of evidence-based measurement, and the measurement didn't just stop there. And so what I'd love for you to do is just talk about a little bit about what you saw before and our original ideas around how EBM and continuous improvement were related.
Yeah. Okay. I think it goes back to something that Mark was talking about when he said, like, its real power is making higher scale organizational decisions, showing where the products or a company can go in certain areas, but having information to back it up. I think that was a huge part of what we were trying to do with the continuous improvement framework. And what its purpose was. Scrum is a continuous improvement framework. These things that help us make decisions in a world today or in a landscape today that didn't exist yesterday. And since the landscape is always changing, we have to look at it frequently to alter what our directions or paths may be there. So in what we're talking about to as far as the transition from one state to the other, even in the operational piece, it's good to use some type of data or evidence to make the decisions or back the decisions up, to have a defensible position on which we're resting these, what they are hypotheses until we show some proof or disprove that it's the right way to go. And I think we do that at a large scale. If a product's not doing well, we make a couple of decisions. We're going to kill it, or we're going to alter the way that we approach the product. When we do stuff inside our organization, we're making decisions for what the organization does, or decisions for maybe even the way our organization operates at a more tactical level. We tend to suffer. That's the way we've always done it. That's just the way it is. It's the situation, and you kind of just grind through. And so this became a really cool tool at both a strategic and tactical state to be able to help make those decisions. Okay, so here's the evidence that sits before us, and then what do we do? Or we're seeing weird changes and dips here, and we don't know what the answer is, but we know that something we should be paying attention to. So it may not perfectly show you the answer, but it can show you when things are not what they were expected to be and should be. And then we have all these talented and intelligent humans to go and help fix those problems. The metrics are fantastic and systems and tools are great, but at the end of the day, the humans have to go solve the problems. And this is just a nod or an indicator or a nudge to get us to go do it.
One of the things that I mentioned earlier was about how we're starting to think about, just from our experiences, what we can add or refine in the EBM guide for 2020. And you're bringing up problems and how we can solve those. And I think naturally, one of the things that we've thought about that's really important is our lack of explanation on continuous improvement, but also this notion of a goal. Yeah. So when we think about EBM and what we're trying to work toward and what value means, one of the things that we have to define really is what are our goals and how we know how we're achieving against those. So let's start from before then, Todd. There's a question in here that I'm going to refine a little bit, but essentially they're saying, hey, we follow certain metrics. So the metrics that we see, and probably you've seen, or I've known you've seen in teams. So velocity, committed versus completed, carryover, et cetera, et cetera. How do we start? I want to know your opinion about those types of measurements and if they're, how do you use them or don't use them? But how do you start with your clients to add the notion of value? Right, because we're stuck into just, let's say these are output and progress metrics, but how do you start to add the lens of value on top of that when you're just so used to, as teams, looking at how your performance is?
Yeah, I think the end statement that Ty made is really how I start that conversation. Ty, you said nudge, right? Mm-hmm. And yeah. So if we're constantly nudging our folks with metrics like velocity or performance-based metrics, right? Oftentimes we'll see, or I see, that organizations end up focusing entirely on that and then not really focusing on customer outcomes like Ty was alluding to. So starting to turn the conversation and how do we nudge the organization? How do we nudge the entire system to focus on holistically what we're doing to focus on customer outcomes, right? And so when you think of that, you can start to think of like the law of unintended consequences when you think about velocity. if you specifically, right? So what if you put in as a metric that everybody wants to increase their velocity by 20%? As Ty was stating, you've got really smart human beings working for you, right? And if their sole gauge is on increasing their performance, they will. But they'll just increase the number of how they're estimating, right? And they're not doing it because they're bad people. They're doing it because that's the only thing that they're being gauged on. Now, if you start to turn that conversation and you start to say, you know, going to your goal statement, Patricia, right? This is our overarching goal. And maybe you have a team in that organization that has a small piece of that goal, and they have a sub goal that leads to their big goal, and they can see and trace that, and they can gauge these metrics that are really conversation triggerers for how we are going to achieve that goal. I think that's a really powerful thing. So in trying to turn the conversation from let's maximize resource utilization because we know exactly what the outcome is going to be, we don't, right? We're in a complex domain into, I feel like I'm borrowing everybody's statements because Ty and Mark really kind of crushed that first question. But as Mark was saying, you know, when using something like Scrum, we know we're in a complex domain. We don't know what we don't know. So just because we're working at 120% doesn't mean that our outcome's certain. So I think that in a long roundabout way, I turn the conversation, that's where I'm going is I turn the conversation in what metrics are you using as nudges right now for your organization, and what cause and effect might that have? And check out this cool thing with 4 KVAs, key value areas, that might be an alternative way to view what customer outcomes you're driving towards and how you're getting there.
Let's stay with you, Todd, and then can Mark and Ty, I'd love to hear your experience also. Can you expand off of that when you have walked into a client and you were doing that, you're saying, hey, let's start by measuring this. What's a concrete example of what you might have suggested in terms of what could we measure, what could we look at to start to flip that conversation from or toward value, let's say, or toward improvement?
Yeah, so I think that the total Scrum Master answer here, it depends, right? Based on what a company is looking for and what they're driving for, you know, just listening and trying to understand and looking at the KVAs just generically, right? Because we haven't really gotten into key value metrics that are underneath those. But if you can find a way, like a call to action, there's always something that a company is striving to do. For instance, your maintenance costs are really high and you can't figure out why. In an instance there, I might look at something like if you have version software, let's take a look at how many of our customers are on different versions of the software and see if we can correlate that to costs and maintenance that we're performing with contracts that don't support that, right? So I think that the first thing I like to do is introduce the concept of the key value areas and see if one's like, oh yeah, we don't ever really measure what our customers think of us. We don't really ask that question in our software or in a survey or by word of mouth. Like we don't do that. So if you can just start by generically talking about the purpose of each KVA and see which one might spark what's creating urgency in the organization at that time, and then following that with a metric that you can begin with to try to turn that conversation. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Ty, what's an example that you had where you was under the guise of something measurement, but under the guise of that you started to talk about EBM, what they could measure to really focus on value and different outcomes, like Todd was talking.
I'm glad Todd said that it matters piece first because I was going to go to the same place. I look at a few things like what are they currently doing? What area do the people who I'm working with have? What data they have access to? But also, what are they trying to achieve? I think in a for-profit organization is definitely looking at different things than a non-profit organization. And then a not for-profit organization, different type of entity, might be looking for something that's that's also different. Like they all have all these different goals. There's a fantastic article that we reference in some of our classes called 30 Elements of Value. And from the Harvard Business Review. I think it's one that, anybody who's in product management or maybe just management should go and check out, just to like kind of find the areas of what you think you're trying to get to, especially when you start talking about those goals, like what's important. Because oftentimes people will think that this one main thing is important, but that's not really what they're trying to do, especially as people starting to merge doing the right thing along with high revenue and profits. They start to get into, maybe we should be looking at different things also. So once you've established what is important to you, what your goals are, what you actually do consider value, then my target is usually something that's easy. I want to start tomorrow or today if I can. So what can I go do? Sometimes people don't have access to the right data. If I can't use how much what our investment looks like as a measurement, can we use time as a currency? And so you start to look at different aspects that you have available to you. But I never want to stop because something was easy. That's where you stop at. And I think you end up struggling with what people are used to, what they currently measure, and what goes into reports, what goes up the chain, and then what you feel you should be after you go and investigate this. And maybe you do both, and but just start seeing which one tells you the truth, because one's going to prove out, or something's going to prove out, and that's really the test. Is after you've done it and you make some hypotheses, predictions, or whatever you have, and which things help you the most. And so whichever one helps you the most is actually the thing that's showing you the evidence.
Thank you. That was a great answer, both of you. Mark, just to extend that a little bit, how have you gotten started using EBM with your clients?
Well, in addition to what both Todd and Ty have already said, you've got to understand what's important, take the measures that you've got. As they also both said, the issue is, what do you do with it? What do you do differently? And so very often, once we've identified what's important and what we're measuring, the next tricky part is getting into the real systems thinking around evidence. And that is what behaviors in the organization can we affect so that our goal, we could actually start to see progress toward the goal. And finding those kind of leading indicators is really quite difficult. And so very often I start with clients in very, very simple techniques to get them going. And a lot of these practices we suggest as part of evidence-based management as well. And some of them have been around a long time. There's just sort of a template around something called goal question metric, where we can start asking questions about people and their behavior and what would cause us to, for example, if it was important, I think Todd mentioned our maintenance costs are too high. And if we take that as an example, well, we can measure our maintenance costs. The problem is that once we've measured it, it's a lagging indicator. There's nothing we can do about it. In and of itself, it is not influenceable. So let's talk about what's driving. What are the causal factors of our maintenance cost, and what behaviors in the organization could we change in order to reduce that behavior? Then we need to focus on measuring those behaviors. So that's quite a tricky thing. Usually about this time also, I would say the client's trying to figure out, okay, we have these measures, we have some of them. How should we be using them? How do we look at them? How do we review them? And I always try to get them to start very simply. Very often, just start with a spreadsheet. You don't need to install some big measurement system. In fact,
Right.
Usually that will slow everything down. Just very simply start to show what your goal is, the measure of the goal, and some of these leading indicators, and then review it periodically on a case, usually every few weeks. And so in that sense, it mirrors what Scrum does, because Scrum pauses and reflects, inspects, and adapts every sprint, which is every 2, 3, 4 weeks. That's exactly what we need to do with these measures. So periodically, we need to inspect the measures. We need to decide what we're going to do about them, and then hold ourselves accountable to those commitments. So that's kind of not right away getting started, because Ty and Todd really well, but as next steps, that's usually how it starts to evolve in my experience.
Okay, thank you. Let's talk about after that then, right? So we're using Excel spreadsheet, we're capturing some stuff. How do you then start to, and this is going to be a series of questions, how do you start to like collate that information? You're using Excel. How do you share that information? Are we looking generally at product? Are you rolling up all the product? Are you just looking at teams? Are you rolling up all the teams? What in your experience have you done to I want to say, collate that information, make it transparent, and then scale it? Ty, can I start with you?
Yep. I start wherever I can, and if it's teams, then just what can the team get out of it? Same thing with the goals, and start with the goal, and then see what you're trying to achieve from there. I love the concept of getting started easy, and if I could start with a team, roll-ups to me start to get weird, because people want to try to homogenize different metrics. One thing might be really valuable to team 1 and not really valuable at all to team 2, but then because we want them to roll up to fit inside our nice spreadsheet, then we say everybody needs to do the same thing. People start to think that's what's important, so they change their behaviors to go do the spreadsheet stuff instead of what they should be. So if we can stick to, even at each tier, what goals are we trying to achieve? And then we start putting the important stuff as, let's measure the goal and then make decisions around it. But then let the people who are getting us to the goal know they should be getting to the goal. And then whatever they want to measure at a tactical level, cockpit metrics, maybe we would call them, or things that are like, it's circumstantial data at a higher tier, but it helps us to make decisions at a lower tier in the organization. That's kind of the start for me with that, and then rolling it up too. And I think there's also an aspect, maybe we'll talk about it a little bit later on like even how to get comfortable with starting to do this stuff.
Yeah. I'm hoping that we have enough time to show some of the dashboards or the things that you guys have created. Mark, you mentioned GQM earlier, and actually all three of you have referenced this notion of a goal. And I want to know what your opinions are in terms of defining how do you know if that goal is right, and does EBM help you with that at all?
Well, of course, there's the goal. If the goal is right or not is really up to the client at the end of the day, but it's got to be, typically they're one of a couple of different types of measures. There's sometimes financial measures like operating costs or profit or something like that. Or sometimes they're around the customer and how the customer's opinion of your products and services. A lot of people measure Net Promoter Score would be an example of that. And of course, it could be the actual operation of the company itself in terms of how things are done. So any of those are good choices, and it really just depends on what's important for the organization. But very often, the goals are not very, are stated in such a way that they're not very important, meaning they're either trivial, easy to achieve, which is, I mean, that's fine, I guess, if you just want to write something on the list so you can check it off. Yeah. And, you know, I see that behavior a lot. Or they're not explicit. They'll say things like, well, we just need to, decrease production found defects. Okay, that's not explicit enough. We have to say, where are they now and where do you need to get them to? At what level is going to actually make a difference for you? So I found that forcing them to be explicit in not only a goal like reduce defects, but okay, well, they're currently at 25 per month, and they better be less than 10 per month. And then the next one that nobody wants to do is, okay, by when? And a lot of people would argue, well, it doesn't really matter by when. My retort is, then it's not very important. So I think this time frame aspect, and we're all familiar with the idea of SMART goals, and really we're just kind of restating that in a sense. It's got to be time-based. So great, you're going to reduce defects from whatever I said, 25 to under 10. And by when are you going to do that? Is it 6 months, or is it a year, or is it next month, whatever it might be? And do you think that's achievable? And it should be difficult. So all of those are discussions that go on. And the one more thing I would mention is the emphasis that this important goal that you're trying to achieve, and where you are is probably known or relatively straightforward to understand. Where you want to get to with that goal is really a hypothesis. There's a reason you wanted to reduce defects, which is actually kind of, if there's a roll-up in evidence-based management, it's from a goal perspective. And maybe at the corporate level, our real goal is to improve our customers' perception of our product and their willingness to refer us to other people. And one of the things we've discovered that's inhibiting that is there are too many defects in the product. So this reducing defect example I've given is probably actually a part of another goal, whether they're using evidence-based management at that higher level goal or not. And yet it's a hypothesis that reducing defects is going to actually improve the customer's perception. So we really need to inspect and adapt the goal itself to make sure that in fact that is the right goal and that we're measuring the right things. So just as I indicated before, we have to find leading indicators. That's also a hypothesis. So from an empiricism perspective, very little can be known for certain. And so we should be constantly seeking to validate that we're working toward the right objectives, that we're measuring the right things, and then adapt if we find that we're not. I think the idea that a goal is a hypothesis is also very important.
Thank you. Yeah, that is important.
I would like to add in some stuff.
Go ahead.
I think the more you go towards the deeper into an unknown aspect, or the deeper you are in the complex domain, you might start losing your ability to say, I know what it is, I know what I'm looking for, I know when I need to have it. But you might keep, so he was talking about the time-based piece, you might still keep those time boxes as a checkpoint just to realize how much have I invested in this endeavor, and do I want to keep going? So while I might not know what the answer is, and I might not be able to even identify where exactly I'm trying to go, when you're doing like cutting edge research into an area that we just don't know much about, you can still use these tools and even Scrum to help you in that space, because you can use your time boxes to keep track of your investment and make some decisions at that point.
Yeah, and can I whittle in just a little bit more there?
Absolutely.
Yeah, and so both those conversations, and I think of, and I keep thinking of, Mark, what you said, that a goal is a hypothesis, right? And to think of a scenario that paints the picture of that, right? So you could generically say, hypothetically, we have an application and that customers need to take and install on-prem at their location. But our goal is to move it to the cloud. So you'll often hear organizations say, the goal, move it to the cloud. Why are we that achievable? Yeah. Great, we moved it to the cloud. That to me is not a very clear goal. The goal that I want to hear, and that I think we should think about a little deeper, is we want the application to be more accessible to customers. And by doing this, by moving to the cloud, we believe we can increase our customer base by 50%. Right, and therefore you can also look at it. We can reduce our maintenance costs because we don't need to support our customers who have an on-prem app. We can move them to the cloud. Right, thinking that way rather than just being like, yeah, let's go to Azure or AWS. Right, that's very achievable, but it doesn't really. That's not even hypothetical. You can do that. Right, but what are you going to measure?
You just laid that up wonderfully for the next question I was going to ask you. So when you start to think about those goals, right, really outcome focused, and to add the techniques that Mark and Ty were talking about. Now, if we were to look at those lower into from the, can you break that down for us? If you were to think about goals, the key value areas and the key value measurements, how do we start to flip the measurements that we look at? How can we tell when something is outcome focused, when it's focused on that outcome versus just an activity measurement? Do you have any, just going through that, give an example of what would be activity versus what would be outcome based, and how do you differentiate those?
Yeah, maybe we can just keep rolling with that situation that I was mentioning. I think everybody's probably fairly familiar with Azure and AWS. And so if you think of activity-based, you could say, how long does it take us to get the application to Azure, right? Like, and are we able to incrementally deliver it? And so you could measure things like so the idea is proposed and then we release it to production, that's lead time, right? You could really say that that's activity based, right? That's our time to market. But on the reverse side of that, you could look at the customer adoption once it's there. So ideally, you're trying to find the fastest path to get a return on investment to the application being in the cloud. But you could measure internally how long it's taking you and the capabilities you have to get it there. Ty, I think we'll circle back to what you said maybe like 27 minutes ago, because I'm wearing a watch. Circumstantial metrics versus direct metrics. That's a great conversation. Circumstantial metrics, like what's our delivery unit capable of when it is getting to the market or turning around a feature or being lagged down by technical debt. Those are awesome empirical measurements for the delivery organization. Direct metrics, what are measurements that we can get that express value from our customers' behalf or how our employees are feeling, metrics that are very direct in how we capture them and what we get, who we're getting them from. Did I answer your question?
Yes.
Oh, we'll often ask, how would you know you're winning if you own the company or if you own the product, right? Those are usually be the direct ones. And then what type of stuff do you have to do to get there would probably be the more.
Can I stop you then? Let me just bridge this in, because this is a question that I get a lot. Now we have 17 minutes, we won't bring in balanced scorecard, but let's talk about OKRs. Okay, since you guys are starting to talk about if we own the company, how do you tie in the notion of how EBM complements or does not complement, or is in opposition or not with OKRs of a company? How do we start to share those goals that we talked about and break them down into different measurements and keep our eyes on essentially the OKRs, but also on these type of measurements? Or are they the same thing? What do you think? Todd.
Okay, cool. I think they can be the same thing. If what you have is, and I see this really tactically with Scrum teams, the product owner is usually the only one incented to build the product. The rest of the development team for Scrum teams have some OKRs that their manager had, that their manager's manager had, but they're not about building their product. They're not about doing what their core job and function is. They're about doing something else. And like he said, it might be about, well, just finding defects. So guess what? People are going to find defects. And so that'll be the metric that we push. It'll be the metric that people optimize around, and we will find every misspelled word and period that exists. And so but you can have this space where the most important thing, or the most important set of things, I think one metric might also be a path to ruin sometimes. But the most important set of things is that, our customers are happy, our employees are happy, and we're making a pretty good profit margin from what we have. So then if those get tied all the way down to the people who are actually executing the work, they will probably be looking out more for, let's eliminate waste around certain things. Oh yeah, customer satisfaction. Well, we all get some type of incentive around that, or we get some type of penalty when it doesn't go well, or we lose that great incentive. Those be the things that we start to optimize around. And so
would you tie any of these to KPIs?
Yeah, because I think that those higher level ones would be the the concept around performance. Now, I know that we're talking about value versus, but if they are actually the same thing, but we're just using different words, then I'm totally good with that. It's when they are those circumstantial metrics, that's stuff that is only about activity, that it starts to get to a bad space.
Mark,
But
thank you, Todd.
one more thing, I would just
Go
say,
ahead.
but then that's usually an indicator for us, probably people who are on this call because we're interested in it, to go have that conversation.
Yeah.
When it's delta.
Hopefully when we can recognize it also. So Mark, we're talking about activity now. You've talked about leading indicators, and activity is something that we can track. Are there measurements that you think that you have tried to avoid when you're helping clients? Are there ones that are damaging? Why are they damaging? And what are some examples of those metrics that can be used as KPIs, as Ty was talking about?
Yeah. Well, and Todd brought up the whole idea of velocity, for example, and often when of course, it's sort of self-selecting, right? As an Agile coach and consultant, people bring me in when they're struggling. I never work with organizations that are doing excellent because they don't need me. And those that are struggling, very often they're trying to find metrics, and so they have this magic velocity metric they think will tell them all they need to know. And of course it doesn't. So a lot, that everybody on this call is probably very familiar with that problem. I try to shift them away from velocity, which has a purpose in order to forecast the sprint, and also forecast content delivery, but it has nothing to do with the whole idea of value. So I try to get them to shift early and right away into estimating the value and measuring that. Now, that's not actual value, that's just their estimate of how valuable things are. So then we can stretch beyond that if we talk about, remember, this is what you think is valuable, and we're going to have to go validate that. So, but again, that starts to get into those measures. I would say that in terms of what measures do I think are bad or that they should avoid, is what are typically called vanity metrics. They're not necessarily bad, they're just useless or unimportant, but they're easy. And for my clients that are trying to adopt Scrum, let's say, they'll do things like, well, let's count how many people have been to a training class. And they do that because it's really easy to measure, but it doesn't tell them anything about achieving Agile results. So pointing out the vanity metrics can be, you have to do that a little bit gently because the people are new to this. And if you really want meaningful measures, they're hard. So now, if we really wanted to know in the sense of adopting Scrum, how many people attended training classes is really not what I care about. What I care about is the behaviors of the people on these development teams and the types of activities they're doing, and also how much output are we getting, and ultimately, of course, the whole concept of value, the outcomes for our customers and users. So usually I see a whole lot of vanity metrics, particularly in support organizations. And so we have to get back and say, okay, I realize that's easy to measure, and it could be that that's actually something you're being rewarded for, right? That even a goal to train everybody in Scrum. And so maybe you have to keep that measure until we can learn what's actually important. But that's what we ought to be measuring, is what's really going to make a difference here.
Yeah.
So those are the kinds of conversations, a lot more gently than I'm doing it right here, of course, with a client, but that's the kind of stuff that we got to work.
Thank you for that. So there are a lot of questions coming in, and I'm aware that the time box, our time together here ends in 10 minutes. So we'll try to get through these different questions. I want to save time at the end for Ty to show the dashboard. But here's an interesting one that I'd like to ask you, Todd. So before we kicked off this call, Todd said, EBM gets me in trouble. And I said, you're welcome. Are there environments, in your opinion, where EBM would not be an appropriate tool to use? Can you give me a 20-second answer?
Yeah, short answer, no. I think that you just have to be careful how you approach it. I think that when you're looking at, and to what Mark was saying, when you're looking exclusively and measuring delivery-based metrics, that when you start turning this conversation into outcome-based metrics, that transparency could get you in trouble.
Ty, I'm going to ask you to show your dashboard, because I think we've had a lot of conversation about, why it exists theoretically, what we think about it. So is there a way that we could flip to your dashboard now, and then maybe talk about how do you start to get comfortable with EBM? How would you get started to get comfortable? And let's do that for a few minutes.
All right. While we're switching over to it, I'd say that this one is a combination of what we've been doing with kind of what I've learned from evidence-based management, and a thing that we got into organizationally. I work for a company called Improving, and what we got into for just management of our own stuff. We used a thing called 4 Disciplines of Execution, 4DX, it's often called. And so, Lindsay, if you'll flip over to the that PDF file, this is me using it for home. I find a lot of times when people ask me questions, how do I become a Scrum Master? How do I learn to be a product owner and all these things? And when they have nothing, I often tell them, I'm like, well, just start doing it where you are, because most of these jobs and things that you want to go do require that you have some experience, so people let you go do them. And so this is me playing around with it a few years ago, or last year, to try to solve a problem that I had. So I was home, as you can see, there's a goal at the very top. It's my wildly important goal. I was home less than 40% or around 40% of the time. That included like weekends and all that stuff. And so I wanted to fix that because it was becoming a problem for me. And the way that I knew it was a problem was, you can see kind of down there in the middle, how happy my family was and how happy I was. And so that thing that lets me know I should do something, that goal, that trigger, that's something we should be measuring to begin with. And I am perfectly fine with qualitative and quantitative measures. People get really like, we only want these hard measures, and I don't think that's true. I think people make more decisions based on emotional context than they will on just the numbers themselves. And so you can see on the left, when Mark was explaining earlier about like leading and lagging indicators, on the left, these were leading indicators, things that I could impact, things that I could do myself. So if I wanted to be home more, I knew I probably needed to get more people to do what I do, so that I can spread that weight out. And you can see my activity over there, and you can see it was kind of low compared to what I thought it should be. But I didn't see that from my just on the go doing my thing perspective. And the results were that I wasn't able to be home much because I was out doing work. And so the more I started to amp up that activity, the better things got for me to be able to be home. Today, I think my number is closer to 70% or something like that. But I had to like look at it in this way to be able to do it. And it really just helped me to put it out on paper, and it helped me to get comfortable with just creating these whenever I wanted to. And this is just a spreadsheet done in. We talked about Excel a lot. I like numbers, it's pretty. And so I used numbers from because I'm an Apple guy.
Thank you for sharing this information. I mean, it's really sharing a lot of what's going on in your personal life and how you can use this. There's certainly examples of how we use this at companies also. So there are some comments coming through about case studies. So certainly feel free to reach in and write in about some of the dashboards we use for case studies, but there are a lot of case studies that are either in progress or on our website on the EBM resources page.
Yes.
There are webinars, and we can talk about more examples. I think Todd and I have something next year, maybe, Todd, that we're going to be talking about, like 8 of your implementations and how it either, helped you, what happened after you created that transparent experience for your clients, and what that meant for them. I want to touch on, let's see, there's so many questions. You guys are going to be so busy following up on these, but I think given that we have an opportunity, 11:56, so 4 minutes, could each of you take less than 1 minute and just talk about, what do you think, why are you passionate about this, and what is one thing that you want the listeners to remember when they're leaving this EBM webinar, about what they can do and why they should be thinking about EBM. So let's start with you, Mark.
Well, it's sort of the same reason I got into the whole consulting gig to begin with, which is that having worked in several organizations that really had adopted an agile mindset with sustainable pace and frequent delivery and a focus on quality, and knowing that the people doing the work were the ones that are going to make the difference or not. I wanted other people to have that same experience. I wanted people to be able to avoid, the death marches and the nights and the weekends and the destruction of their livelihood, their lives and their families and all of that. So that's kind of my personal motivation for why I got into this to begin with. And originally, I worked more at the team level or multiple team level. But to really make a difference, we got to get the whole organization thinking this way. And for me, I think evidence-based management is an important way to help the organization really begin to get a focus on goals, sustainable pace, and a focus on the people. So that's why I'm in this.
Excellent. Todd?
So absolutely +1 what Mark said. I believe, having been through many a death marches, that anything I can do to help avoid that. But what I'll say really in general is that I think metrics, more so than anything, are triggers to have conversations with people and different people in organizations. And I really believe in the fact that these metrics, evidence-based management in general, triggers the conversations with the right people at the right time. I do caution that you must look at them holistically, but I feel like when we focus solely on the performance-based metrics, the conversations that are triggered are very narrowly viewed. And this helps to bring time and attention and transparency to talk about things that we need to talk about that we might be avoiding, or things that we talk about that we can continue to maybe do better. So conversation triggers is my big thing with EBM.
Thank you, Todd. Ty?
I think mine comes from like my own personal motivators. I really want to know that I'm performing well and what things lead me to go there. Being a guy who grew up with comic books and superheroes, I want to know that I'm doing the right thing. I think that's really important to me to feel that I'm doing the right thing, and humans are involved in this. So a lot of times, like Todd was just saying, when we look at just performance metrics, there's a removal of humanity from the equation, and humanity matters a lot. And this is important. We are actually impacting people's lives and their livelihoods, their families. So this helps me to get there and be able to compete and perform well.
So thank you to the three of you. Thank you to everyone who is listening and who submitted questions. There are so many questions that we didn't get to answer. I apologize, but we'll figure out ways to address them. So there are questions in there, guys, anywhere from how do I measure technical debt? These measurements are getting tied into estimates and they're putting pressure on the team. What do we do about that? How do we tie this into the Scrum framework? How do we tie this into our software development lifecycle? how often should we be changing metrics? So there are a lot of really detailed questions that we'll be looking at, and we'll find some way, maybe through social media or just responding to you individually. But please do feel free. There is a question about the EBM guide and how do we build feedback on that. Just feel free to email me directly, patricia.kong@scrum.org, or support@scrum.org, and that will be a great way for us to build on some of that feedback. And I might put something out more widespread later. But for any of you who are not aware, we do have learning paths. So there's a lot of questions in there that actually are answered in some of our learning paths through the Scrum Master, Product Owner, Team Member, and Agile Leader journeys that we have on our website. So I want to encourage people to be aware of those questions that you have are actually answered in some of these learning journeys. And there might be webcasts, or there some different blogs and papers that are there. I think that a great question that I wanted to ask, but we didn't get to, is how does EBM help? And we talked about the organization, but how does EBM help the Scrum Master? How does EBM help insert role? I would love for us to talk about those things, because as a Scrum Master, I'm interested in X. As a product owner, I'm interested in accountable for X. How does EBM help me there is something that I think we really could address, and maybe Mark will put that in the upcoming workshop. But thank you very much for everyone's attention. Thank you to Ty, Todd, and Mark, and that's it for today. We'll talk soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.